You're listening to the Cycling Podcast in association with Rafa, celebrating the sport and producing the finest cycling clothing since 2004.
Hello, my name's Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Burney.
Hello, Richard.
And in the Berlin studio, Daniel Freeb.
Hey chaps, how's it going?
Hello, Daniel. Good, how are you?
Alright, what's happening over there? I hear Brexit's going well.
Well, we got rid of you.
That's Frexit.
Voted with my feet.
Anyway, we've got quite a different podcast this week to last week, which was dominated by one topic, and that was Bradley Wiggins and his TUEs. We'll actually be hearing the final part today from some of our listeners. We got a lot of response to that episode. A lot of you listened to it as well, which was good, and there was a lot of reaction, and a few of you sent in responses, audio clips of response. A few others of you sent in emails. We'll hear a selection of those responses in the final part of today's episode. So if you've had enough of all that, you don't need to listen to it. In the first couple of parts, we'll be talking a bit more about bike racing, the Tour of Lombardy in particular. We'll look ahead a bit to the World Championships. But before all that, Lionel, can you give us the weekly news roundup, please?
As the stagehands prepare to lower the curtain on the 2016 road season, some key players were determined to ensure the final act was packed with drama, and so we were treated to a thrilling edition of Il Lombardia, the final classic, monument and World Tour race of the season. Esteban Chaves of Orica-BikeExchange rounded off a brilliant season by adding the race to the Giro dell'Emilia he won last week. It was a great example of a one-day race with Romain Bardet, the Tour de France runner-up, Rigoberto Urán and Astana's young rider Diego Rosa all in the mix at the end. Not only was Chaves the first non-European winner of Il Lombardia, he was also the first Colombian to win one of cycling's 5 monuments. That's the 5 biggest one-day classics on the calendar: Milan-San Remo, the Tour of Flanders, Paris-Roubaix, Liège-Bastogne-Liège and Il Lombardia. There was also a Colombian winner of the Milano-Torino one-day race, with Astana's Miguel Ángel López Moreno adding that title to round off an impressive season. Now the World Championships are just around the corner, and one of the fascinating subplots of the men's road race is going to be how the French team support their 2 joint leaders, Nacer Bouhanni and Arnaud Démare. With the race little over a week away now, both riders have staked their claim to be the top dog by winning races. Bouhanni won the Tour de Vendée and Démare won the Binche-Chimay-Binche, which is also known as the Memorial Frank Vandenbroucke these days. Another couple of wildcards for the Worlds are also in great form. Dylan Groenewegen and John Degenkolb won races this week. Groenewegen, who might be the Netherlands' best hope of a medal in Qatar, won the Tour de l'Eurométropole in Belgium, and Degenkolb, who's not a bad third man for the Germans to have after Marcel Kittel and Andre Greipel, won the Münsterland Giro in his home country. We'll have a full preview of the men's and women's World Championship road races next week.
Thank you for that, Lionel. That sounds very noisy where you are, Daniel. Are you in the middle of something, some kind of action?
Not really, just a cafe, just a happening cafe.
Well, you live in a very fashionable part of Berlin, as we'll discover next week when we come and visit you there.
Yeah, why are you? I've still not really got to the bottom of why you're coming. I think some kind of buyout is in the offing.
Yeah, you're getting sacked.
Are you gonna come with armed with 2 briefcases full of money?
We wanted to do it face to face.
Full of euros, hopefully, because pounds are worth nothing, unfortunately, these days.
We're going to get in trouble for straying into political areas here, Daniel. Let's keep it light.
Keep
Talk
it bike racing.
Cycling.
Bike racing. Tour of Lombardy. Il Lombardia, as we are now told it's called. That was a great race, wasn't it? Fantastic race. Esteban Chaves, a wonderful winner. A bit like the Olympic Road Race, I watched it knowing the result, and it's quite interesting to watch a race knowing the result and just to watch who you know are going to end up as the main protagonists and what they do. I was chatting to Lionel about this earlier. You know, you often talk in bike racing about, you know, not burning too many matches or, you know, only having 2 bullets. But when somebody's on great form, you know, I watched Chaves and he put in a big sort of counter-attack at about 55 kilometres to go in pursuit of Romain Bardet. The man of the match, really, apart from Chaves, Diego Rosa. What a power of work he did, really, throughout the final hour and a half of the race for Fabio Aru, who didn't have the legs to go with that 3-man move of Bardet, Chaves and Rigoberto Urán. And Rosa bridged across to them while they were riding hard on his own. I thought he did an incredible ride and unlucky not to win.
Well, an incredible or an incredibly stupid ride, depending on whether you're watching it from the point of view of Astana's director sportif, Giuseppe Martinelli, who wasn't very happy, or from your point of view, Rich. I mean, Martinelli was particularly aggrieved with his attack with, I think it was about 1,600 metres to go. He didn't want to wait for the sprint. He thought that Chaves was going to be faster. And he also led out the sprint very early, didn't he? And, you could also argue that Fabio Aru gave him the green light a bit too late. I think he gave him the instruction to ride for himself on the Selvino, which was the penultimate climb. And having done all the work that he had done, Rosa, he had really compromised his own chances to a certain extent already by that point, but was still strong enough to almost win. It bodes well for Team Sky, who we think he's going to Team Sky next year. There was talk of BMC at one point, but it bodes well for them and his chances of really having an impact or making an impact there. But yeah, slightly questionable tactics, I would suggest.
But having done all that work, I think that might have made him a bit less confident about the sprint. And Chaves was very quick in the sprint, so maybe he was right to try and catch them off guard, because he'd already been sort of dropped. He got back and tried to catch them napping. I think he had. I meant it was a great ride from the point of view of a great physical performance. Just to have the strength to lead the group for so long and then bridge across to those three while they were going pretty hard themselves. It was an incredible physical performance, and I suspect he was pretty tired by the end and had to take his chance where he thought it might be.
Yeah, and I think Beppe Martinelli's making those comments about a rider he knows is leaving the team. I wonder whether he would have been so critical if Rosa was staying with Astana next year, because Fabio Aru in the final kind of wash-up escaped criticism, and he deserves some criticism for allowing...
Not being good enough.
Well, yeah, for not being good enough, but particularly for allowing Rosa to do all that work for him as the designated number one in the team, and then very late on saying, actually, no, why don't you go for it? And that really compromised Astana's chances of winning the race far more than Rosa, who, as you say, Rich, was then trying to conjure a victory, having done a lot more work than the other protected riders perhaps would have done. Chaves in particular, I mean, he rode very cleverly. He did do a lot of sitting on in the final, and that was the sort of the warning sign for me as I watched it, was that he was the one that would be the easiest to underestimate, really. I really thought Rigoberto Urán would have the fastest finish. I thought in the sprint he would be the strongest, and Chaves surprised me, so perhaps it's not... perhaps it's understandable that he caused a bit of a surprise at the finish. But I think Martinelli's comments about Rosa are harsh, and they smack of sort of old school Italian team manager wielding the big stick when he knows that really as a team they cocked it up.
Yeah, and I think as far as Chaves' performance was concerned, it's another extremely impressive result for Orica-BikeExchange, and he'd already won the Giro dell'Emilia the week before, so he was clearly in really good form. But what impresses me most about this team, well, there's several things, but one of the things that impresses me certainly is how mature they're very young. Well, they're not really team leaders, Chaves is, but the Yates brothers have become very important riders, but they're still quite inexperienced, but they ride in an incredibly mature fashion, and Chaves did as well, very economically. I mean, Rich, you said he put in several attacks, but every attack had a purpose and really fulfilled the aim that he had for that particular attack. And it was a jigsaw puzzle that he was slowly putting together, and the team was slowly putting together as the race wore on, and that's really been a feature of their very successful performances, certainly in the second half of the season, even in the first half of the season. And I was just watching a few days ago all the backstage passes that Dan Jones puts together for that team, and the ones that he put together on the Vuelta a España, and there were two very notable stages there, the one to Goret and the one to the Aitana, where the team really pulled off real masterstroke, and it just struck me how kind of mature the dynamic was between the directors sportifs and Neil Stevens in particular and the riders. He gave them a blueprint every day, but he was certainly very flexible and taking a lot of feedback from the riders and sort of saying, well, guys, this is the plan, this is what I'd like you to do. Are you able to execute it? Just to tell me if you're not. And most of the time they were, but it struck me as a dynamic that it probably doesn't occur in some other teams. I think some other teams go out with plans, and Lionel, you talked there about Martinelli being an old school Italian direct sportif, and sort of the old school model is for direct sportifs to say what they want and dictate, and if it's not executed then they get very angry. But I think it's key, or it has been key at Orica-BikeExchange, that the riders themselves have got a lot of latitude and to execute the plans and are treated like adults, really.
And you've got to have riders capable of executing even their own plans. And as you say, Chaves, he rode a smart race. He wasn't hiding, though. I think he identified Bardet as a good wheel to follow. I was quite surprised that Bardet sort of collapsed towards the end, seemed to suffer from cramp, but just ran out of legs really towards the end, which was quite a surprise. But I think Chaves, he's a killer, isn't he? I mean, it's very easy to underestimate him. The smile, the sort of cherubic features, but he rode like an assassin. I mean, he's pretty close to Rigoberto Urán. Urán helped him out a bit at the Giro, but there was only one thought in Chaves' mind, certainly, when they got away. And it was just the two of them at one point. Chaves rode very smartly at that point, I think, which probably allowed Rosa to get back on. But, Chaves, everybody was talking about Urán as the favourite for the sprint, but Chaves clearly knew exactly what he was doing and was very confident of being able to do it. Yeah,
when I said about Chaves, following wheels, I'm referring really to the end. Let's make no mistake, he really created his own opportunity by getting up the road with 55, 60 kilometres to go. And overall, as a race, it was fantastic to see these kind of mountain stage race type riders all going at each other on what was a beautifully designed course. I really was impressed, but not just by the placement of the hills and the difficulty of the hills, but also just the scenery. I mean, it is one of the most beautiful races of the year. The old cliche about the falling leaves, that part of northern Italy looks stunning at that time of year, and it was great to see these riders really going for it in an event stripped of any kind of greater significance. There's no overall classification to race for, so the one victory on the line, and you just really saw who had the legs and who had the brain to try and get themselves over the line first, and it was Chaves, and it caps a fantastic year, not just for Chaves but also for Colombian cycling as well, Daniel?
Well, yeah, I think they won something like 56 or 57 UCI class or UCI ranked races this year. They've had the leaders jersey in the Vuelta, they've won stages in the Vuelta, they finished on the podium in the Vuelta. The Giro had the leaders jersey, they won stage in the Vuelta, in the Giro. Atapuma was very good in the Tour of Switzerland, Pantano at the Tour de France, and they could still cap it off with victory in the World Road Race Championship with Gaviria. Who knows? And he's already been Omnium World Champion this year. So, yeah, an incredible year, really, and all the more remarkable because Colombian cycling is still not backed by fantastic organisation, and there isn't anything like the budget that's kind of supported British cycling and has really produced this golden generation of British cyclists. I mean, they've really, to a large extent, had to do it on their own. I was reading some interesting stories last week about this race they're trying to launch in Colombia, the Tour del Café, the tour of the coffee producing regions in Colombia, and the Colombian Federation seems to have given very little support to that because they're really looking after their own interests. And there's a lot of rumblings of discontent in Colombian cycling, and the Vuelta a Colombia, the national tour, is really struggling. It's a 2.2 race, but not really even respecting the rules that the UCI lay down for 2.2 races. And yet you've got this incredible generation of riders and incredible support as well that we talked about and we saw at the Vuelta, and this might be the high watermark for Colombian cycling. I don't think it is, because these are young riders, Quintana, Chaves, who have still got a fair bit of growing yet to do. But what a fantastic year it's been for them, and from our point of view as spectators and as journalists and as people who enjoy the sport, it's really added an extra dimension to professional cycling over the last few years.
Miguel Angel Lopez, another one who won Milan-Turin, and is even younger. Another great talent coming through. There seems to be no end.
There does. Well, I mean, you mentioned what a great year it's been for the Colombians. It's also been a pretty good year for Tinkoff in a certain way. Peter Sagan has won the individual title in the UCI World Tour, and Tinkoff came close and perhaps could have taken the team title as well. Their boss, Oleg Tinkoff, the owner of the team, who's bowing out, bringing that team to a close now, pretty dissatisfied with Alberto Contador declaring himself to be unwell for the final World Tour race of the year, Il Lombardia, because if Contador had been up there in the race, Tinkoff might have overhauled Movistar and they might have won the team classification as well. And that led to Oleg Tinkoff making some pretty strong comments about particularly Alberto Contador in an interview with our colleague Stephen Farrand of Cycling News. Daniel, did you see that interview? What did you make of Tinkoff's comments as he bows out from running one of the biggest teams?
Yeah, it was typical sort of deranged raving, wasn't it, from Tinkoff? But we're also making some fairly good points. And very interesting about Contador, that what Tinkoff said, and what he'd already said to me actually during the Tour de France, Oleg Tinkoff, but it tallied exactly with what Johan Brunel had told us about Alberto Contador for our special that we released recently, that when Contador goes into a team, he comes almost in a capsule, a sort of self-contained team within a team. He brings his press officer, he brings his mechanics, he brings his director sportifs, and to a certain extent keeps himself to himself. And added to that is his very sort of serious, meticulous approach to racing, which is what you would think an employer would want and expect. But Tinkoff, certainly Oleg Tinkoff, has not particularly enjoyed spending time in and around that Contador capsule over the past 3 years, and he said to me at the Tour de France that at the dinner table when Contador's around, the atmosphere is not particularly good. Everyone's kind of watching what they eat, watching what they say, watching what they do, and but a lot of this you would expect of Tinkoff, not only because he's very outspoken and outrageous, but also because he's the kind of guy you would expect to get on better with Peter Sagan, and he's more similar in character and temperament to a Peter Sagan.
They struck me as not very nice comments. I mean, they did, the point about Contador being in his own sort of cocoon of people is one thing, but I have to say that Tinkoff comes across as a bully a lot of the time, and I didn't think they were particularly nice comments. I think Johan Brunel explained all that in a far more nuanced way in terms of the way that Contador operates. And let's face it, it's worked pretty well for Contador. I mean, he won the Giro d'Italia for Tinkoff only last year. I thought, Tinkoff's comments were not really appropriate for an employer and unfair. Contador will not probably respond because he's got more class than that. He's not the sort of guy who will enter into what we call Twitter spat or anything like that. I imagine he'll keep his counsel. I'm actually off to Gran Canaria at the end of the month to spend 5 days with Alberto Contador. So that interview will be coming up in the cycling podcast. I'm not just saying all this because I've got that coming up, and I don't imagine Alberto Contador listens to the cycling podcast, but they left a bit of a sour taste for me.
So, Rich, does that mean no champagne for you for a whole week?
It sounds like it's going to be pretty boring. I'm going to have to take my own stash, I think.
But, Rich, in fairness, we wouldn't really expect nice diplomatic comments from Oleg Tinkoff, would we? And people get very upset and they get very exercised by what Tinkoff says in interviews. But when you're talking about, and the comparison has been made with Donald Trump, and there are some similarities, when you're talking about someone who's potentially going to run a country,
Tinkoff.
then yeah, it is offensive and it is alarming.
Tinkoff's not running for president of Russia or anything, is he?
No, I don't think he's got any designs on that. But in Trump's in Donald Trump's case, Tinkoff, we're talking about someone who employs 70 people, and I also think that we shouldn't forget that he created and has funded a team which perhaps or probably wouldn't have existed otherwise. So he's given jobs to around 70 people for how long has he been owner now? 3 years. But as far as the negative side of what he has brought is concerned, we're not talking about someone who's running the country. He's running a team, and I think we should only really.
I think we're arguing for here is perspective, Daniel.
Yeah.
Controversial.
Yes.
Well, I would say that whilst he is employing 70 people, he's kept a team going that would otherwise perhaps have folded. There's an undercurrent. It's not even an undercurrent. It's pretty obvious that Tinkoff believes that his vast wealth means he can behave exactly as he wants and say exactly what he wants. And I suppose there is an element of justification, certainly in his own mind, that's fair enough. I suppose the only way that would run into trouble is if the riders and staff in future, if Tinkoff were ever to return to cycling, voted with their feet and didn't join a team that he was running. I suspect that the money that he would be offering would make that unlikely, and that when the push comes to shove, people have been perfectly happy to take Tinkoff's money, and presumably they learned pretty quickly what taking that money entails. There is a downside to it. I'm not sure I'd like the cycling podcast to be run along those lines, Rich?
And the other aspect to this, Lionel, the other caveat, I suppose, is that various team managers or people involved in the sport have suggested to us over the past 3 or 4 years that it doesn't make the sport look particularly good when people are coming out and saying some of the things, some of the completely inappropriate things that Tinkoff has been saying, or acting in the inappropriate manner in which he's been acting. For one person's entertainment is another person's offensive behaviour. Even the way he celebrated some of the victories, some of the results they've had this year, Peter Sagan at the Tour de France sticking one finger up at the camera and so on. In some people's eyes that creates interest and creates excitement, but other people would argue that actually would maybe it damages the credibility of the sport, and it damages the image of the sport, and it makes other investors less likely to come in and put their money into cycling, because the whole sport can look like a bit of a circus.
Eurosport, the home of cycling.
Thank you very much to Eurosport for sponsoring the cycling podcast. Coming up on Eurosport, of course, the World Championships from Sunday the 9th of October. We've got the women's and men's time trials on Eurosport 2, and then throughout the week there's a lot of under 23 time trial action, women's time trial, men's time trial, and of course the road races the following weekend. We'll preview them properly in next week's podcast, which will be coming to you from Berlin. There's been a lot of racing on Eurosport the last week as well, and it's been nice being at home and being able to put on the telly in the afternoon and watch a bit of bike racing, quite apart from the Tour of Lombardia. I enjoyed the Euro Metropole the other day. That was an entertaining race, won in the end by Dylan Groenewegen of Lotto NL Jumbo. Thanks to Dan Hackenberg for pronunciation help with that. Just outsprinted Oliver Naesen, the Belgian rider from I Am Cycling, who had been in the break, Naesen, and the break was caught, and then he was up there in the sprint. It was quite remarkable. Also notable in that race for an incident earlier when Jens de Bucher and Jurgen Rollins were bridging across to the break, the two Lotto Soudal riders, when Rollins hit his teammate's wheel and fell off, and that ruined what might have been a very promising sort of counter move. So that was an entertaining race. There's lots been going on, but the big one is the World Championships coming up in Qatar, and as I said, we'll preview the road races properly next week. We've got the team time trials first, and the women's and the men's are on Sunday. I spoke to Hannah Barnes the other day. You can hear a bit more of that interview in a special podcast we do for members of the Rafa Cycling Club. But she, of course, rides for Canyon-SRAM, who've actually won in previous incarnations every single edition so far of the women's team time trial at the World Championships. So she'll be part of that team on Sunday, and then she'll be riding in the road race for Great Britain as well. But Hannah Barnes has been out in Qatar for a few days now, and here are her early impressions.
I think the heat is going to play quite a big factor in the race. We've been here 3 days now, and yesterday we it was really hot. We tried to do our ride that was kind of the time that we were going to be racing the road race in the team time trial, and we felt it a lot. And I think also the wind's varying quite a bit. The first day we were here, the wind was 30k an hour, and it's gone down to 15 today. So, I mean, on the day you could have winds that are blowing in echelons everywhere, or just quite a boring race. So I think it depends, but the Pearl is definitely going to be an interesting race. It's kind of just almost a big criterium. So it's going to be a really fun race, I think, and not like any other Worlds really.
Who in your mind are the favourites?
It's definitely, I think it's being looked upon as a sprinter's course, of course. So I think Chloe Hoskins is going into it as one of the favourites, probably Kirsten Wild, George Ronzini potentially, Jolene DeHoore. So I think it's anyone's race really. I think anything can happen on a course like this, because you can't anticipate the weather and how it's going to play out. And also the course, even though it's going to be flat, there's a lot of corners and roundabouts and hairpins. So it's going to be a pretty tricky one.
So that was Hannah Barnes of Canyon-SRAM, and I mean, we'll talk about Qatar as a venue. Already controversial. The World Championship has been pushed back later than ever. There's talk already of the heat perhaps shortening the race. Speculation at this stage. We don't know if that will happen. It would be a great shame if it did. But the team time trial has also been mired in a bit of controversy. I think only 10 World Tour teams are riding. It's a very strange lineup of teams of very varying standards. Looking at the start list, I reckon we could have got a cycling podcast team in there.
Who would be in that?
Only three of us, producers.
Francois, Giro, Tom Wally, one of our producers, very good rider.
He would, you don't want,
I think he'd rip us to pieces, wouldn't he?
Rip our legs off.
Anyway. Yeah, the whole thing about the World Championships being in Qatar, it potentially could descend into farce if the temperatures get very high. It's been moved to this part of the year to avoid September, which is unbearably hot. I think early September certainly can be pushing 50 degrees Celsius. Even at this time of year, it can be 40. Rich, have you been over to see the Tour of Qatar? I went maybe about 9-10 years ago now, and it was a very pleasant sort of 23, 25 degrees C at that time of year. That's late January, early February when they hold the Tour of Qatar. But a lot's been made of this, the possibility of shortening the road races in the event of extremely hot weather. But at the moment, it's not really been any hotter than temperatures that the riders at the Vuelta a España might experience, high 30s or 40 degrees. I mean, obviously, the difference about Qatar is that there isn't really any shade. So when the temperature gets high, basically it's extremely hot, very exposed right out in the sunshine. People are already talking about whether or not the UCI's extreme weather protocol, which was brought into action at the start of this year, will have to be called upon. The thing about the UCI's extreme weather protocol, though, is that it's extremely vague. It doesn't give any indication of what temperature would be determined as extreme. So we really are in the dark here, and we're speculating. We don't know at this stage, 10 days out from the races, exactly how hot it's going to be. But it's a risk that the UCI took by awarding the World Championships to Qatar, knowing it would still be very hot at this time of year. And I think if the races are dramatically shortened for any, even by sort of 50 or 100 kilometres, it completely changes and devalues the rainbow jersey and puts a completely different complexion on it. But that's speculation, and as you know, Rich, I don't like speculation. I'm not a weatherman. I don't work for the Met Office, so I can't tell you how hot it's going to be. But we'll keep an eye on that one and certainly talk about it next week.
You'd be like a sort of reverse weatherman. You'd be telling us how hot it had been and what the weather had been like, wouldn't you? You'd stick to the facts. But well, the team time trial isn't likely to be shortened, but it is an old, a race that was introduced to the World Championships a few years ago now, not that long ago, and hasn't really captured the imagination, fair to say. I mean, there has been this protest, if you like, World Tour teams not all riding, very few are riding. I was quite surprised to see Francis Desjeux not riding. They've had some successes in team time trials this year. I was looking at, again, on Cycling News, I saw a little mention of the fact that teams are given €2,000 each to help with the expenses of taking part in this event. And that's not going to cover very much. When you think about all the bikes that have to be transported over there, the extra staff, the teams don't really have a presence at the World Championships at all, because it's for countries rather than trade teams. So it seems a huge effort that is required, especially when the World Championships are in a place like Qatar. Huge effort and expense is required by the teams. And for what? What do you get for winning the team time trial? You don't even get to wear a rainbow jersey in team time trials. It's a very almost meaningless competition. I mean, some of the teams have put an emphasis on in the past and really prepared for it properly and won it and enjoyed the win, but really, is it something that's captured people's imagination?
And yet the thing is that it was some of the trade teams that were pushing for this, isn't it? The trade teams wanted a presence in the World Championships. Teams that in the past had placed great stock in their ability at team time trialling. I'm thinking, Cervelo, Cannondale, Garmin, BMC, of course, who've won it a couple of times. That they were among the people that were agitating to have some kind of team time trial event at the World Championships. It's an anomaly because it's the only event that is run as trade teams rather than as national teams. Back in the day, there used to be a road team time trial at the World Championships. Usually, it was a 4-man, 100-kilometre amateur event. Maybe something like that would be more appropriate for the Worlds. But you're right, Rich. It doesn't really fit in with the World Championship, and with it being in Qatar, I'm thinking of when they have a team time trial as part of the Tour of Qatar, they normally make it for riders on road bikes, so that their teams, specifically so the teams don't have to take all their time trial equipment out there, which does add to expense significantly. €2,000 isn't going to cover travel expenses at all, is it? I mean, it's a drop in the ocean, I'd imagine.
Just looking at it was reintroduced, or it was introduced for trade teams, because it used to be for national teams, reintroduced in 2012 in Valkenburg. It's only ever been won by 2 teams, Omega Pharma, which is now, of course, Ethics Quick-Step, or BMC, who have won the last 2. Looking at it, only 5 teams have ever won a medal in these 4 editions so far of the team time trial. Orica have been up there, Team Sky won a medal in 2013, and Movistar won a bronze medal last year, but otherwise it's been dominated by those 2 teams, BMC and Ethics Quick-Step.
And Rich, you talked about, or Lionel, you talked about it capturing the imagination or not. These standalone team time trials do not have a particularly good record, and they don't tend to survive too long. I don't know if you remember, I don't think you probably fondly remember the Eindhoven team time trial event, which was another thing that was supposed to really highlight the sort of mystique and the special challenges of team time trials, and that was introduced to the World Tour in, I think it was 2005, and that lasted only about 2 or 3 years and was a real dead donkey, wasn't it?
That was, and it was an Heim Verbruggen vanity project, that really, because I think it went through his hometown or past his house or something like that, and that was a successor to the Grand Prix de la Libération, which was another team time trial event, I think also held in the Netherlands in the early 90s. You're absolutely right, Daniel. It's a standalone team time trial event, when it's, in this case, 6-man race. In a Grand Tour, obviously, a team time trial would be 9 riders, and it would have that extra layer of importance, that context of the GC battle. But as a standalone event, it doesn't really work. And I do fear, I don't want to be a naysayer and a doom-monger here, but these World Championships do threaten to throw into a pretty sharp focus quite a lot of the problems at the heart of the running and organisation of professional cycling as a whole, and particularly the UCI's place within that, because I think the World Championships, it's struggling a little bit. This year particularly, it's been pushed back. It's going to be probably a sprint for the men's road race, or probably for all of the races, and there is a risk that they may be reduced to little more than a sort of criterium in the desert, and I think that really would not portray what should be one of the elite one-day races on the calendar in a good light at all.
Well, and not with the kind of crowds we expect or don't expect in Qatar either. I mean, our experience of the Tour de Qatar suggests we should expect the crowds to be extremely sparse indeed, and that never looks good on television, does it?
Whoever you are, wherever you ride, whatever the reason, Rapha exists to improve your ride with the finest kit, inspiring stories, and vibrant clubhouses and communities all over the world.
Thank you very much to Rafa for sponsoring the cycling podcast. Very grateful to them indeed for their sponsorship and support. And we're working with Rafa on at least one exciting event coming up sometime before the end of the year. Stay tuned for more information about that venue and what the precise topic will be. We'll be announcing that pretty soon on the podcast and on social media, etc. So stay tuned for that. Now, in last week's episode, it was really dominated by one issue, which not everybody agreed with. You know, we completely ignored the Eneco Tour, for example. But we felt it was a subject that needed to be explored in some depth and talked about by the three of us. It was about Bradley Wiggins and the TUEs, a scandal that kind of erupted after the release of private data by the hacking group Fancy Bears, who have hacked into World Anti-Doping Agency systems and released details of lots of athletes' TUEs, therapeutic use exemptions. But the ones that raise a lot of questions for people concerned Bradley Wiggins and his treatment before three of his major targets, 2011 Tour de France, 2012 Tour de France, which he won, and the 2013 Giro d'Italia. Triamcinolone was the product, a corticosteroid, and a lot of discussion about that. We talked about it, as I said, last week, but we were very keen to hear what you, the listeners, thought, and we got a lot of responses, didn't we, Lionel?
We did, yeah. We asked if people wanted to record themselves making their particular points, and quite an amazing response. And we're going to play some of those. We've put those together. We'll play those in a minute. Just on our coverage of the Bradley Wiggins story, I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because most of the time we're covering the racing that's going on. We focus on professional cycling, its politics as well as its the sporting aspect. But the Bradley Wiggins story and the way it found its way into the public domain, it dominated the sports media, not just the cycling media, for a number of days, certainly until Bradley Wiggins broke his silence on the Andrew Marr show, and then the spotlight switched to Dave Brailsford and Team Sky's response, which then came a few days later. It was the big story of the week, and I think we couldn't half do it. We had to give it, our full consideration, and unfortunately, that did mean that we overshadowed the Eneco Tour and the other racing that was going on. But
and since our podcast, Bradley Wiggins also gave a long interview to The Guardian, which you can read online, and added a bit more detail, which did answer some questions for some people. I think also, for us, a lot of our listeners are English speaking. If they're not British, they're English speaking, and a lot have invested a lot in Team Sky, and so what that team does, how that team operates, what its ethical code is, does matter, and especially Bradley Wiggins as the first British Tour de France winner, presented as a case study really of an athlete, a rider who could win the biggest event in sport clean. That was a seminal moment, really, and so we can't just ignore the fact that this information has come to light, and we have to examine and really look at what it means. We're not talking here about smuggling in bags of blood in a refrigerated box on a motorbike, which has happened in the past, but it matters, and I think the response illustrates that. Let's hear from some of the listeners who did, and we want to thank everybody who did send in the responses, some really interesting ones, very well thought out and nuanced, and it's a complicated one. It's not black and white, and some of your responses reflected that. So let's hear from some of you now.
Hi chaps, this is Chris in Cheltenham. Just wanted to give you my thoughts on the Wiggins TUE situation. The whole situation to me now seems tainted with these TUE revelations. The 2012 Tour to me seemed like a bit of a watershed for pro cycling. With these revelations of Wiggins and the kind of court, kind of brings a different perspective to it. My wife and I have got tickets to go to the London 6 Day in a few weeks, but I can't say we're really looking forward to it now.
Hi, Joe Robson, long-term cycling fan. I've been very disappointed by the news and revelations regarding Wiggins and his TUE. I thought when Wiggins won the Tour that finally someone had won it clean, and we had a British athlete that we could be proud of, and he'd proved that you could win the Tour without drugs. But it turns out he didn't win the Tour clean. He was on a powerful performance-enhancing drug. Okay, he didn't break the rules, but in my mind essentially exploited a loophole. Again, I'm left with a feeling in cycling they've been let down, and again we're in the same situation where there's no clarity and we don't feel that we can trust anything anymore, and this has happened so many times that you start to get very disillusioned with the whole sport.
I suppose in answer to your question, this TUE controversy to me reeks of the Lance Armstrong I've never failed a drug test era. During that period, it benefited the UCI greatly to have a cancer survivor as the champion of the sport. The UCI were completely complicit in that taking place. And it feels, and it pains me to say it, that that's what's happening at the moment. Is the TUE system being used, and this is just me being an incredibly skeptical person, as a means to legitimise drug taking within cycling? And if it is, we are in a very, very dark era for cycling.
We heard there from Killian Cook, but not everyone was so quick to condemn Wiggins and Team Sky. Both Luke Watson and Rob Harper were satisfied with the story that the TUE for triamcinolone was used for genuine medical reasons.
I would like to watch bike racing, and which hopefully involves the best riders in their best condition. If that means riders taking medicines, fine by me.
You mentioned several times that it was the timing of Wiggins's TUEs that you found slightly suspicious. I think it's also informative to consider the timing of a TUE that wasn't there. If these TUEs are some sort of evidence of willfully gaming the system to gain an advantage in Grand Tours, why no TUE before the 2011 Vuelta? The fact there isn't one for that fits much better with the theory that these TUEs were genuinely for allergies which would have been prevalent in spring and early summer, but not in late summer.
Some of the harshest criticism was reserved for the way that Team Sky have conducted themselves in the wake of the release of the TUE data. Here are James McKenzie and Ollie Wright.
Sky would do well to think whether they should have been transparent at the time with Sir Bradley Wiggins and the TUEs that he had before the Grand Tours. In terms of their bid to be clean and transparent, I don't think they've been very transparent, but that's probably an unfair sort of judgment, given that nobody else in the pro peloton discloses their TUEs unless it is released somehow. It's tough that the athletes are the ones that have to get out front and centre as though they're the sort of sole person who's made the decision and then have to defend the decision. They're not doctors. The TUE panel are the ones that made the decision, so you know, they should be the ones that have to step up and justify it, not the athletes, in my opinion.
My big issue, and I think it's many people's issue around this whole TUE scandal, is the timing of Bradley Wiggins' injections. They come before each of his main objective for those 3 seasons. It very much seems to be the case that Team Sky wanted to make sure that he performed at the top level for those races, and it's probably fair enough that he does need it to maintain a level playing field, but it does raise a lot of issues, and I think Team Sky and Bradley Wiggins and British Cycling have been very poor at addressing these specific concerns around timing and the pursuit of that marginal gain. I think Team Sky, Bradley Wiggins and British Cycling need to do a lot more.
Hi, my name's Julian Barr, just responding to the Cycling Podcast discussion on TUEs and Bradley Wiggins. For that particular part of it, Sky really, shouldn't be surprised by the media attention that's become attracted by this story. They've set such high targets and they've set themselves on such a platform with, it has to be said, I think, a touch of arrogance, which I think comes from Brailsford. So you set yourselves up, you're going to have a big fall, and they may not have broken actually any legal rules, but certainly morally there's something that doesn't ring true about this whole story.
As well as criticising Team Sky's arrogance, Julian Barr also highlighted what he sees as the grey area between banned substances and legal supplements.
On a wider subject, it's always surprised me the sort of very thin dividing line I see between what's seen as a performance enhancer, what's seen as a legal drug, a banned drug, and supplements. There are so many things that athletes take these days that seem to be just the norm. I'm pretty sure that the people at the top are doing their best, the majority of them, to try and change the way the sport was viewed and how it was run years ago. But that's going to take a long time, and it's quite right that the media have the attention on anything like this. But supplements, I mean, there's a great film called Clean Spirit which follows, not Giant Alpecin, Argo Shimano, their previous team name, Argo Shimano at the Tour de France in 2013. There's a section in there that features one of the team doctors, I think he's a team doctor or soigneur, and he's distributing the various different tablets and pills, supplements that the riders take in a hotel in the evening, and they're all different colours and they're in these little boxes, and they're all legal but all very strange. And you see these things being handed out from the team car during the tough stages. I mean, it isn't a surprise that these things have become so important, given that if you look at it as well, especially the Grand Tours, 3 weeks, 21 days of relentless, hard, tough sport, which really the body probably isn't designed to take that much abuse for 21 days. You know, why should you be taking pills, whether they be herbal stuff, caffeine pills, whatever's in them? You take pills when you're not well to aid recovery, and really the test of an athlete is one that can stand up to the rigours of competition, and this is extreme competition. But to say that you probably need to take this and that at the end of every day maybe is not the best way forward.
For many people, particularly fans of Team Sky, this story has put cycling in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Perhaps no one put that sense of disappointment better than Maria Griffin.
A friend of mine watched the Andrew Marr show, and she came to me afterwards and she said, "Oh, I saw Bradley Wiggins on the Andrew Marr show, and cycling is still all doping again." And my heart sank. An ordinary cycling fan like myself, I just want to be able to have someone in authority who understands what's going on and be able to trust those people. I don't want to need to know everything about medicines and drugs in cycling to understand what's going on in the sport, but you seem to be able to have to do that. I spent half my time Googling stuff around drugs just to understand what the debate is. And what's really, really wrong is that we should have a governing body that's strong, that understands what's right and wrong, that has very strong practices, that patrols them very well, and that is in line with WADA. And if there are areas where these practices can be got round, they should be ahead of the curve on this, not behind. They seem to be miles behind.
We also had a lot of emails come in, didn't we, Rich, from listeners who perhaps didn't want to record themselves making their point, but wanted to offer their opinion. All of them very thoughtful, expressing a wide range of views. And Rich, I think we're going to read a few extracts now. Over to you.
Yeah, some very long submissions, so apologies we haven't been able to play everything, and we haven't been able to play all of your audio, and we won't be able to read out all of your emails. But, you know, really, really interesting. A lot of you have followed the sport for a long, long time, and, you know, it really matters that you can believe in what you're watching. And I think this is at the heart of the issue, isn't it? Stuart Starr sent us in a long email. Interesting. Thank you, Stuart. In summary, he said, "It's really the straw that's broken my camel's back. I think there's a huge element of doubt in what Brailsford Wiggins is saying in defence. They didn't convince me. The timing is very suspicious. 3 injections each time just before a Grand Tour doesn't wash with me, and I have to agree with what Richard said when interviewed. I think Wiggins and Sky have crossed an ethical line, even if not a legal one. And as Daniel said on the podcast, it's not what I signed up to."
Well, on the flip side of that, George Carler makes a very good point. He says, "I'm not a particularly big Sky fan because of the Murdoch link," he says, "but I can't help thinking that they have done nothing wrong. I'm 100% against taking illegal drugs, brackets doping, but it is their right to push every rule and test every loophole and go right up to the line in order to get the best possible performance out of their riders. Pro cycling is possibly the most extreme endurance sport on the planet, and of course they will be taking every legal supplement possible for their bodies to perform at that level. If no rules are broken, then they've done nothing wrong. There aren't any grey areas. I don't think Sky need to work within different rules due to moral reasons based on their values and mission statement."
Yeah, and Ian Green asks a couple of questions. He asks, is it feasible that Wiggins tried an injection of corticosteroids for the first time right before the Tour de France? I have absolutely no medical background, so this is a genuine question, but if it were me, I'd want to know how I was likely to react to it before having a jab right before a year career-defining stage race, and if he'd used this intervention before, then when? For what it's worth, in answer to your question, what listeners think of this topic as it affects Team Sky, personally, it doesn't change anything for me. I always assumed that they were committing to outlaw EPO, human growth hormone, illegal transfusions, etc., but I assumed, because they said it, that they'd aggressively seek any edge-conferring benefit they could find within the scope of the regulations. And just finally, also Liz Miller, who's a regular correspondent, and I know she's a big Team Sky fan. She says it would be interesting to know if any other teams have riders who had similar TUEs. It could actually be quite a common practice for all we know. And she makes some comments about Wiggins and Sky appearing to be on the back foot with the story and taking several days to respond to it, and that seems valid enough. So again, thank you very much for all your feedback and responses. I'm sure they'll keep coming, and we certainly welcome them. Contact at thecyclingpodcast.com. And that's about all for this week. We're off to Berlin next week. Daniel, I hope you have an exciting itinerary planned for us.
Not really. I'm hoping to see as little of you as possible. But anyway, the potpourri will be out, chaps. You know, the red carpet, the potpourri. The shake
and vac.
I don't have carpet, so there won't be any shake and vac, but there would have been.
Oh, really pulling out all the stops there, Daniel. We're touched. We're actually staying in a hotel. You do know that?
Yeah. But alarmingly, perilously close to where I live.
I must say, before we end this week's episode, thank you very much to the chap who came and said hello to me in my local pub the other night. Introduced himself as a friend of the podcast, and that was nice. I didn't catch your name, but you said you listened to every podcast, and very much appreciated you coming and saying hello. Hope I bump into you again in the area. Thank you. That's all, I think, for this week. Daniel, we'll see you in Berlin. Thank you.
Okay, see you, chaps.
Thanks, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
You've been listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Thank you to Glass Pear for the music in this episode. For more information and to download more editions of the show, visit thecyclingpodcast.com.